Chapter 18. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "It don't make no difference. None of it." "It does so matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across his mouth, and then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully. And besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward, as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between cough fits, she took to sucking on one of the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort very annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. "You eat that all up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. "See, all day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room." "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce, and then, moving the strings with the sticks with his one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole while, at the same time, with his other hand, he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh?" Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he could fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely, so high above the world, she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "She wants you too," he said. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms, so Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You got to look for falling stars. Them are the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make you a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Chapter 19. The days passed. The sun rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home, and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy, and he did not care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled, and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death, and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, at the end of the twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3, and Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat, and in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey." Bryce stood over her and said, "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please, please breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh, no," said Bryce. "Oh, honey, take a little breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her, and now she is gone. How could this be?" he wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued, and there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, and that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. "She ain't yours," Bryce screamed. "You can't take her. She ain't yours." But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself, and then finally the boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles," Bryce said. "We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Chapter 20. "How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life?" Bryce said to Edward. "I can tell you how many I seen. One. You. That's how you and me are going to make some money. I seen it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put on any kind of show right there on the street corner, and people pay 'em for it. I seen it. They walked to town and took all night." Bryce, without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back. The feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden. The feeling that nothing mattered and that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body hurt. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside it. "Mama," said a small child, "look at that bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother. "Dirty." She pulled the child back away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said. And then after a long pause he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement. But the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with deep, dark eyes. "Pellegrina?" thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. "Look at me," he said to her. His arms and legs jerked. "Look at me. You got your wish. I have learned how to love, and it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. "Fix me." Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was gone and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't going to cry no more." Bryce wiped his nose and his eyes, and with the back of his hand he picked up the button box and looked inside it. "We got us enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles." Chapter 21. Neil's Diner. The diner was called Neil's. The word was written in big red neon letters that flashed on and off. Inside it was warm and bright and smelled like fried chicken and toast and coffee. Bryce sat at the counter and put Edward on a stool next to him. He leaned the rabbit's forehead up against the counter so that he would not fall. "What you gonna have, sugar?" the waitress said to Bryce. "Give me some pancakes," said Bryce, "and some eggs. And I want steak, too. I want a big old steak, and some toast, and some coffee." The waitress leaned forward and pulled at one of Edward's ears, and then pushed him backwards so that he could see his face. "This your rabbit?" she said to Bryce. "Yes'm, he's mine now. He belonged to my sister." Bryce wiped at his nose with the back of his hand. "We're in show business, me and him." "Is that right?" said the waitress. She had a name tag on the front of her dress. Marlene, it said. She looked at Edward's face, and then she let go of his ear, and he fell forward so that his head rested against the counter again. "Go ahead, Marlene," thought Edward. "Push me around. Do with me as you will. What does it matter? I am broken. Broken." The food came, and Bryce ate all of it without even looking up from his plate. "Well, you was hungry for sure," said Marlene, as she cleared away the plates. "I reckon show business is hard work." "Yes'm," said Bryce. Marlene tucked the check under the coffee cup. Bryce picked it up and looked at it, and then shook his head. "I ain't got enough," he said to Edward. "Ma'am," he said to Marlene when she came back and filled up his coffee cup, "I ain't got enough." "What, sugar?" "I ain't got enough money." She stopped pouring the coffee and looked at him. "You're going to have to talk to Neil about that." Neil, it turned out, was both the owner and the cook. He was a large, red-haired, red-faced man who came out of the kitchen holding a spatula in one hand. "You came in here hungry, right?" he said to Bryce. "Yes, sir," said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "And you ordered some food and I cooked it and Marlene brought it to you, right?" "I reckon," said Bryce. "You reckon?" said Neil. He brought the spatula down on the countertop with a thwank. Bryce jumped. "Yes, sir. I mean, no, sir. I cooked it for you," said Neil. "Yes, sir," said Bryce. He picked Edward up off the stool and held him close. Everyone in the diner had stopped eating. They were all staring at the boy and the rabbit and Neil. Only Marlene looked away. "You ordered it. I cooked it. Marlene served it. You ate it. Now," said Neil, "I want my money." He tapped the spatula lightly on the counter. Bryce cleared his throat. "You ever seen a dancing rabbit?" he said. "How's that?" said Neil. "You ever been in your life seen a rabbit dance?" Bryce set Edward on the floor and started pulling the strings attached to his feet, making him do a slow shuffle. He put his harmonica in his mouth and played a sad song that went along with the dance. Somebody laughed. Bryce took the harmonica out of his mouth and said, "He could dance some more if you want him to. He could dance to pay for what I ate." Neil stared at Bryce, and then without warning, he reached down and he grabbed hold of Edward. "This is what I think of dancing rabbits," said Neil, and he swung Edward by the feet, swung him so that his head hit the edge of the counter hard. There was a loud crack. Bryce screamed, and the world, Edward's world, went black.